Good morning, everybody. It's so great to see so many of you here today. My name is Emma, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm on the marketing team here at SafePass, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by three amazing panelists. So we have Stephanie Kane-Clark, Cyber Manager at Deloitte, Ian Burrows, ex-VP Business Controls and SOX at Millicom, a leading telecommunications company, and Navinda Kaplish, Client Service Director here at SafePass. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we do get started. So the session will be recorded for reference after the session. All attendees are on mute, but we'd love you to participate in the Q&A we have at the end of the session. So feel free to pop over your questions in the control panel, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end of the session. So before we start, I'll ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right into the discussion, which is why you're all here today. So Stephanie?
Sure, thanks, Emma. So I'm Stephanie Clark. I work as a manager in Deloitte's cyber risk practice. My main focus over the last 10+ years has been helping companies through large transformation projects, as well as GRC tool implementations with a specialty in Oracle ERP. So I started with Oracle EBS, and now a lot of my focus is on the Oracle Cloud side. So I have a lot of experience with different GRC tools and have been working with Nav and Emma over the last year or so, specifically around SafePath.
Thanks, Stephanie. Ian?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. So my name's Ian Burrows. I spent the last 5 or 6 years as the VP of Business Controls and SOX at an organization called Millicom Cellular, which is a $6 billion international telecommunication company based out of Miami, London, and Lux, with operations all over Central and South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And really my focus over the last 3 years has been taking Millicom through a internal control transformation journey, culminating in the listing of Millicom on NASDAQ back in 2019. And as part of that, I implemented an internal control framework across the organization in order to comply with the US Sarbanes-Oxley requirements, and with a particular focus on IT general controls in our ERP environment.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Ian. And last but not least, Navinda.
Hello, Emma. Hello, everyone. So I'm Navinda Kaplish. I lead governance, risk, and compliance programs for SafePass globally. In terms of background, I come from a Big Four background, ex-Deloitte and EY, where I've had different roles. I've been an internal auditor, an external auditor. I've worked with clients as an advisor on large GRC programs, specifically focused around the niche area of ERP systems, mostly Oracle, which is a bit of a niche area, and helping various clients get SOX ready. And now I'm leading GRC programs at SafePass for our global clients.
Excellent. So just a brief introduction into SafePass for those of you who don't know us. We've been in the GRC space now for about, 20 years, helping ERP customers, and we're really focused on streamlining audit risk and compliance to mitigate risk across the entire organization. So we started our journey as Fulcrum Way, which many of you may know, and Fulcrum was an early leader in providing corporate GRC solutions to EBS customers in particular. And then a few years ago, we transitioned into SafePass, and as you can see, we have a complete platform of risk management solutions, right from fine-grained access management for segregation of duties, access certification, for example, to controls monitoring, all the way across to process automation. So that's basically what we do in a nutshell. So let's start with the questions, which is why you're all here today, and take a deep dive into the discussion around next generation risk management solutions for EBS and beyond. by beyond, we mean, if you're considering moving to the cloud, or if you're already live on cloud, or if you use multiple ERP systems, SAP, NetSuite, PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, etc. So let's start and talk about the current challenges your EBS customers are facing. So who'd like to take a stab at this question? Navinder?
Yeah, sure. So the Oracle E-Business Suite, and I guess in a way similar to other ERP systems, including Oracle Fusion, for those of you who have Oracle Fusion, these are complex systems. They're really the heartbeat of your back office, especially your finance and procurement processes, your HR processes. And if you're SOX, if you're SOX compliant, then you know that these are key systems for you to get SOX certified. The auditors really look out for transactions here. Some of the challenges that I've seen customers face. Number one challenge is generally around segregation of duties, which is a specific IT general control, which says that a single user should not have access that allows him or her to either commit financial fraud or to misstate accounting information, going back to the legacy of Enron. And it's really quite difficult to get this right, because the EBS system has literally tens of thousands of forms, and you really need to, as an organization, you need to sort of define a segregation of duties matrix around the principles you have, and then translate that into Oracle forms and make sure that you don't give people access to forms that conflict. It's very difficult to do that manually, which is where automated solutions like SafePass help. That's detective segregation duties. A couple of other issues I've seen, challenges I've seen customers face. Preventative segregation duties as well. So how do you make sure that over a period of time your internal controls environment doesn't deteriorate? So having some good controls around the user provisioning process when you assign access. That's really not as straightforward as it seems. Normally when you say starters, joiners and leavers, starters, movers and leavers, you think it's straightforward, but it's not if you think about it from an SOD perspective. And of course periodic review of access as well. I've seen clients have really complicated Excel files which go from the central controls or SOX team via email to hundreds of people who have to validate, and then somebody has to collate all of that. So periodic recertification of access, basically, what are the roles that users have appropriate. That exercise is also quite painful if done manually, and tracking sensitive access, tracking privileged access that users have. These are some of the challenges that we've seen EBS customers face. EBS has been around for, I don't know, 15 years or more, 20 years almost, even if you take the older versions into account. And these are still challenges we see customers facing because of the complexity of these systems.
Yeah.
And I would say now, in addition to some of the at the access level for users, also when it comes to change management of some of those responsibilities, or if your EBS environment and the way that you're using it, the modules continues to evolve over time, and you need certain responsibilities to assign to users that maybe at the time of go live, maybe those responsibilities were clean or free of SOD conflict, but as changes are needed or new responsibilities are built, that's something that over time can change, and without a GRC tool to monitor that, it can be quite a blind spot on the access side. I think also in terms of configuration monitoring, a lot of times such a big advantage of using EBS and other ERP applications is that there are potentially automated controls that are built into the environment, such as maybe workflow approvals, and a lot of organizations are relying on these configurable controls as part of their control environment. But at times, maybe not maliciously, but some of these configurations are maybe changed inadvertently. And so that's something else that the GRC tools can help with, monitoring some of those key configurations that are supporting the control environment and providing that visibility so that teams don't have to do that manually as well.
Yeah. And what about you, Ian? What challenges have you seen?
Look, I mean, I think anything around IT general controls in an IT environment is going to be challenging. I took Millicom through a SOX implementation program. ITGC was our single most complex, most time-consuming area, and also had the highest risk attached to it. And when I'm, from a risk perspective, when I'm looking at an ERP, anything that goes wrong in terms of IT general controls around an ERP system has a real pervasive impact across the organization, because it calls into question every control that relies on reports coming out of that system. So, for me, it was really the number one risk area. IT general controls, so access, privileged access, change management, segregation of duties, all of those control topics in the context of the ERP were some of the topics that concerned me most and took up probably the most time internally, getting ourselves prepared in terms of how we effectively design an approach, and then then implement and roll that out across the organization, and also get the sort of interested stakeholders comfortable with that approach. So whether that's internal stakeholders in IT, end users, process owners, external auditors, there's a lot of work that goes on, getting all of those viewpoints and interests aligned in terms of getting an effective internal control framework, one that everybody can be comfortable, from a reliance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So those customers that are planning to stay on EBS, how can these complex challenges that they're facing, that you've just all talked about, how can they be addressed with solutions such as SafePass?
Yeah, so I'll take this one. So I think from my perspective, such a big value add of implementing a tool such as SafePath is that for customers who are planning to stay on EBS, you can get that framework in place. So establishing what those key configurations are within EBS that you want to monitor. What are those segregation of duties risks that you want to monitor? What does your organization consider sensitive access? And getting all of that framework in place to support the current EBS environment. And then, as the company and the application landscape evolves in the future, those additional applications can be brought onto the SafePass application. So there's not necessarily a need to wait in terms of when new applications are being implemented, because SafePass is able to integrate with other, whether it be cloud applications or maybe just other applications that are supporting the business. So I think that that's one big benefit of SafePass. Another thing is that SafePass is still started out as an EBS tool, so there's a lot of robust functionality as it relates to EBS, and also still, if companies are planning to stay with EBS, that SafePass is able to continue to support them. So if there's a change in something new, a new business object, for example, that is a key configuration for them that they want to be monitored that maybe wasn't available at a certain time, that's something that Nav and team help work with to continue that support for customers who plan to remain on EBS for the foreseeable future.
And what about those planning on migrating to ERP Cloud, for example?
Yep. So I think if EBS, for a lot of companies that are planning to go over to ERP Cloud, it's not always clean cut. There's maybe a phased rollout, and so it makes sense to implement a risk management tool probably ahead of time. The sooner the better. When we were talking with Ian about when's the right time to implement GRC tools, as early as possible, right? Because as part of the organization potentially remains on EBS, you continue to have that visibility. as some of the other organization, even if it's a big bang approach, starts to migrate to ERP Cloud, you have that framework in place so you can start to monitor all of those things in your future state environment. Other thing to keep in mind is just the pure act of a new system being implemented and undergoing that transformation internally introduces some other risks that are a little bit different than some of the operational risks we've been talking about. You know, some of those classic GITCs, as you're going through that implementation, you have service providers who are going to have access to your data, to your systems, and having a tool such as SafePath that helps to have that visibility into not only the people who work within the organization who are potentially part that have that access, but also who are these service providers. And, you know, as people come onto the team and leave the team, making sure that their access is appropriate and not excessive. Also helping to monitor some of those service accounts that maybe get set up during the implementation. And also just helping maybe, for example, as the service provider is doing configurations, migrating code, whatever it may be, into Oracle Cloud in one pod or environment to check to have that quality assurance that it's matching some of the other environments as well. So it helps both from a risk perspective as well as efficiencies perspective to try to get GRC tools involved in the process earlier rather than later. I think we've seen a lot of clients who are quite overwhelmed by their migration to Oracle Cloud. And so that their thought is, hey, let's get that stood up and then let's come back to the risk management piece. And that tends to create a lot of additional risk and potentially blind spots that then it's a effort and money to clean that up later on.
Yeah, Nav, do you wanna add anything there?
Yeah, other than what Steph just said, just a couple of points. I think the most important point from my perspective is when you're doing a major ERP upgrade, whether that's from Oracle EBS to ERP Cloud, or maybe from SAP to Oracle ERP Cloud, or whatever it might be, just don't forget about controls. I mean, what tends to happen on these projects, and I've actually led some of the ERP projects, so I have a pretty good understanding, is that the focus is generally from an IT perspective on delivering the new system by a certain time in a certain budget, which is absolutely perfect. But if you forget about controls in that process and don't have somebody looking at certain specific business control areas and access control areas that tend to be problematic right through the implementation, then you have a very expensive piece of work coming up at some point post go live. That's from my experience. I mean, having, for example, an expert organization, somebody like Deloitte, who actually have this skill set, working with you through the process makes it much easier. And the other point I have around this is Oracle ERP Cloud comes with certain nuances which are quite different to other versions. You've got various concepts, and I'm not going to bore folks with technical concepts, but you've got certain types of roles which are seeded, and then you've got to create custom roles. And sometimes if you just copy what comes out of the box, you inherit a lot of roles and privileges which you don't even know what access you end up giving people. So it's just make sure you really design the security model appropriately so that you can avoid future issues. So those are the 2 points I just wanted to add to what Steph said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, Emma, we had a recent example where a client was migrating from their old system, so PeopleSoft and a few other applications, and going to Oracle ERP Cloud. And their approach, like Nav said, is get these modules live by this date. And throughout the implementation, there are certain custom roles that were developed to support the business processes. And then some people took over the security administration, which was quite new for them because it's a new system for them, a little bit of a different skill set. And going through the project, they had made a series of changes to those application security roles. And the organization didn't have visibility to see, hey, over the course of the last 6 months and the tail end of the implementation, a whole bunch of excessive access has been introduced to users. So then, as part of the implementation, there's typically other vendors in there and other stakeholders, whether it be internal audit groups or potentially external auditors doing pre-implementation reviews. And when those third parties came in and did a review, it raised lots of red flags, really in a really short time window, right before go live. Client was then struggling, and then had another vendor to try to do more cleanup on those roles, and then have to pay those external auditors more money to come and re-review, since the first audit raised a lot of red flags. So it's just, if you have a GRC tool that's in place and you have the right people monitoring the tool and using its functionality, it can just help provide that real-time feedback, so that, oh, okay, there was maybe someone requested additional access. There was a reason to give them that access, but that triggered this SOD conflict. Was that approved? Or, how do we go about tracking all of that, rather than having to do so much rework on the background, which really incurring a lot of cost for organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about those planning to stay on EBS, those that are migrating or considering a migration to the cloud. So what about those that run more than one ERP system? Organizations often run multiple ERP systems and hundreds of applications, on premise, in the cloud. So how do they address, risk in terms of, having multiple systems and applications?
Yeah, so I think I touched on this a little bit more. We talked about maybe clients that are on EBS and then planning to go to Oracle Cloud ERP, and maybe they're running in parallel as part of the cutover. But most I think organizations that we work with now are not necessarily a 100% Oracle ecosystem. Whether it be, there might be other HR systems in play, or maybe other systems that are helping with invoicing or master data. And something that's been, a hotspot for auditors as of late, I would say, is looking at segregation of duties risks, not just inherent within one application, but does a user have the ability to do certain transactions or certain configurations in multiple systems? So I think that's one benefit of SafePass or other GRC tools, is that it provides you the ability to kind of have one place where you're looking at segregation of duties risk within your ERP, if Oracle, maybe Oracle Cloud, maybe Oracle EBS, but also SafePass has the ability to integrate with those other applications as well. So rather than trying to either, maybe manually monitor some of that access or have separate kind of silo GRC tools, I think something that it helps with efficiencies and obviously cost to have a one-stop shop where the different stakeholders have that ability to view into cross applications. And then in terms of other capabilities, Nav, I don't know if you want to talk on that, but I think what we see a lot in the marketplace now is, a desire to have more capabilities within a single tool, instead of having to run, like I said, a different GRC tool for different applications. And also maybe as it comes to some identity and access management capabilities, making sure, although a lot of organizations have certain tools in place to help with identity, sometimes those tools don't have the ability to do the fine grain SOD, so really at the most granular level. So I think, figuring out in terms of what's the application landscape look like for all of these types of support tools, whether it be identity tools and GRC tools, and figuring out what are the sweet spots for each of those applications. That way they're complementing one another. And what are really the pain points the organization has is really what capabilities they should be focusing on.
And just to add to that, I think earlier to the point that Ian was making around IT general controls being the most complicated area for SOX implementations or indeed risk and compliance programs, having multiple systems just extends that out multifold, because you sometimes have to consider access controls across systems, access certification across systems. So who has access to what roles in which ERP system? And I think having a GRC tool which can look across would be really useful. That's all I'd add, Emma.
Do you want to add anything there, Ian?
No, look, I mean, I think I'd echo all of those points. From a client perspective, the more that you can use one GRC tool to, to identify, monitor, manage, your internal control risks here, the better. I think it should be the ultimate objective. It's not easy, but I think if you can look to tools where you can bundle capabilities together and deal with multiple multiple systems, multiple platforms, because as Stephanie said, ERP is a core of any financial system, but many organizations may have different ERP environments, HR, billing systems, maybe other add-ons around procurement or supply chain, or whatever. And, risks around, access, change management, risks around segregation of duty, cut across all of those platforms. So the more that you can link those platforms together from a risk management perspective, the more you can use one tool to do that, the easier and the more effective your controls and your risk management program is going to be.
Yeah, thanks for that insight there, Ian. So let's go back to our EBS customers. So, for example, why is staying on outdated GRC software a risk for organizations? So why should they start looking at next generation solutions?
Okay, so I'll suggest a couple of thoughts around this. So there are certain software vendors who, as they move to a newer version of their system, they naturally stop developing the older versions. And if your GRC software, if you're using a GRC software that is one such, software that isn't being developed, bugs aren't being fixed on priority. The vendor is basically saying that we are going to stop supporting it in a few years, and they've got a timetable around that. It's a big risk, because what that means is the tool is no longer dynamic. It's no longer keeping with market trends. You might miss out on certain key controls, key developments around controls, whereby the output that you get out of the tool, you might have more manual activity to do, which is exactly what you don't want when you invest in a GRC software. So I think having GRC software that is up to date in terms of the vendors actually focusing on it, developing it, constantly improving it, is a big advantage. And I think I'd just like to make a point. There are two different types of, when I say GRC software, it's a broad term. You've got the GRC software applications like the Archers and the metrics teams of the world, which are generic GRC solutions where you can run a SOX program, you can document all of your risks, and you can document all of your controls and all of your evidence, which is a very different thing to GRC software, which is specialized, like SafePass, which is purely focused on alleviating specific IT general controls risk around ERP systems like Oracle. So this is very specialized, but the comments I've made around the risks around outdated GRC software apply to both camps. And we do have large vendors who have very much ERP specific GRC software who are not supporting that software anymore, which makes it a large risk for organizations.
Yeah, I would just say also, as I've said, generally the way that you use your ERP application is going to continue to be dynamic and change over time. So the way that it's implemented on day one, you still have an operations and support team that are potentially developing new functionality as your business continues to evolve. So if your GRC tool is stagnant and supports that, it becomes less and less useful for the organization, because as maybe there's new functionality that the business has started to use, and potentially you want to track some of those configurations, but for example, those objects are not available, and your vendor is no longer developing those objects for you to use, now you need to develop a manual process, right? So now you're trying to have people who are using the GRC tool to try to gain efficiencies, but then also have to do things outside of the system. So it makes it less useful over time. And also, if you have an issue where, for example, it's an on-prem and it's connected, your GRC tool is connected to your on-prem environment, and there's something that's wrong with the connection between the two, and maybe the data isn't interfacing over completely and accurately. Now you're in a position where your tool is completely useless until you're able to troubleshoot that. And that was something I had seen in the past, just some issues with data coming over at some point due to there being too much data or whatever it may be. But obviously, with any tool that your organization's using, it's technology and there's a risk for it to break or there to be bugs. And so you really need your vendor to continue to support you through that to make sure that your tool that you're continuing to pay for as an organization is really meeting your needs.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's I'm sure you all have lots of stories and lots of case studies that you can share with our attendees here today. So Ian, do you want to start off by sharing some experiences?
Yeah, sure. So, as I said up front, I've spent probably the last 5 or 6 years grappling with the challenge of implementing a SOX compliant internal control framework in a multinational organization. So, I think, up front there, we identified that IT general controls, or ITGC, around EBS, that was going to be, one, if not the major challenge. In particular, as sort of alluded to before, segregation of duties, user provisioning, user recertification, things like how we keep track of and monitor significant configuration changes, sensitive changes in the system. So a whole array of control topics around EBS that we identified as complex problems that that we needed to solve. And I suppose maybe I'd highlight sort of 5 or 6 kind of key learnings from my perspective, and I'm talking here as the as the project sponsor for the whole of the the whole of the piece of work around internal control framework in preparation for the listing. And maybe it's worth saying that whilst a lot of my work was focused on the the requirements needed to comply with with US SOX, I think the learnings are applicable to any organization who is going through an internal control transformation program, not just applicable to US SOX. And there are many other territories in the world that are looking at corporate governance in this area. In the UK, a lot of some people may be aware, a lot of proposals around a UK SOX type regime coming up. So I think everything we're talking about today is equally applicable. I think so for me, a couple of key learnings. One is around stakeholder management. There's a large number of stakeholders involved in any kind of internal control program. The IT team themselves, end users, process owners, information security, internal audit, external audit. Don't underestimate the time and effort that's required in terms of collaborating and working with those individuals, because the more that you can get alignment of your work, the more you can deliver a program that can hit not the needs of users, the needs of the internal control community, the needs of information security professionals, cyber professionals. The more you can work collaboratively and get one framework that hits all of those requirements, the better. But it does take time and it does take effort to get that alignment. Secondly, on a similar theme, you know, I would mention the external auditors here. So, you know, a lot of your work, particularly around ERPs, are going to be, you know, your work is going to be used by an external auditor if they wish to rely on internal controls, and that is one of the big paybacks of investment in a program, you know, in a program around internal control. But, you know, in my experience, don't assume that the external auditor will know everything about a GRC tool. Don't assume that an external auditor will know, you know, your ERP, in depth as a subject matter expert. You know, that you also need to spend time with them, you know, walking them through what you're doing from a risk perspective, what you're doing from a controls perspective. Educate them about how you're doing it, and talk to them about, you know, some of the choices that you might be making, particularly around, you know, how you define your segregation of duties, you know, what roles, you know, you're identifying as particularly sensitive or privileged, you know, what things you are monitoring, you know, through through alarms or through alerts, because, you know, they will have some views on what they consider is important. So, you know, spend the time with them up front, going through your decision making process, and that will maximize their ability to leverage your work, their ability to rely, and ultimately that is part of the payback for the investment in terms of time and effort. Thirdly, you know, give yourself plenty of time for, you know, for this work. If you've got hard deadlines, such as a listing, you know, such as a year end coming up, or whatever, you know, give yourself time, because to do it properly, to design, you know, test, you know, do lots of dry runs, do lots of pilot testing, you know, there is quite a lead time here, particularly as I mentioned, when you're working with lots of other stakeholders in this environment. So build a realistic timeline around your program, and as I said, give yourself lots of time to, you know, to pilot test before you absolutely need to rely on, you know, on the outputs of a GRC. A very positive one, I would say, and from my experience, was actually that, you know, that we actually had unexpected cost savings coming out of the program that we implemented, and how we used SafePass. So, you know, some cost savings that actually weren't part of the business case, but actually when we went through the process and we looked at using SafePass for you know, for automating the user process, automating the setup of new users, we actually found some cost savings that we didn't originally expect, in terms of, you know, not needing, you know, the time and effort from an external help desk as much as we had previously done. And actually those cost savings ended up being quite significant, and as I said, you know, and a real added bonus for us, quite compelling, particularly when talking with talking with the IT team, and talking with, you know, with the CTI. So that was a real, you know, positive outcome. And then my final learning as well is, you know, don't forget about controls around the GRC platform itself. If you're using a tool such as SafePass, you know, that also needs controls around it, around access, around change management. And again, you know, the more, you know, you want to rely on the output of this, you want your external auditors, you know, to rely on the work you're doing. They will look at, you know, the controls around the GRC itself, and it can be really easily overlooked in the excitement of working through the the core design and implementation. But don't forget about those, otherwise you might be tripped up at the end.
Thanks for that, Ian. What about Nav and Stephanie? Do you have any case studies that you can share with our attendees today?
I think Ian's covered a lot of really good points. I don't really have much to add, Emma. I think that was an amazing explanation.
Okay, Steph?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ian has a lot of perspective on the value add from his side, being a client. I would just say, like, from a case study perspective, the just most important success factors that we've seen are making sure the right people are engaged, like Ian said, and just keeping in mind that, you know, a GRC tool is still another tool. So making sure you allocate time to train the users, test it, identify how it can best help the organization. I've seen some cases where clients have been interested in GRC tools and they've figured, you know, we can just stand this tool up ourselves, or we can just have somebody come in for 2 weeks and quickly configure the tool for us, and then we'll figure out how to use it. I think a lot of us who have been through large scale transformations, either on the audit side or as the implementer, know that the number one thing for success is the change management. So just think it is important to understand who the stakeholders are, bringing them along for the ride, and then making sure that you're not just configuring a tool and then you have no idea how you're going to use it, and making sure, like Ian said, it's still another application that you do need to manage. So the testing piece after the configurations have been set up are so important to show. If you are going to rely on using some of the outputs of the tool, how can you be sure of the completeness and accuracy? Making sure you have all of the evidence for that. That's something that being on the external audit side of some GRC tools is something that, you know, we've said, hey, if you, like in my past life as an auditor, just if you're planning on using this, how do we know that all of the information that's within the tool is accurate? So you do want to make sure that you have all of that documentation and you've allocated enough time to get all of that testing, so that both internal and external stakeholders are comfortable with how the tool is being used.
Excellent. And what about the future? Where do you all see risk management solutions heading in the future? Or where would you like to see risk management solutions heading?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll start. I think we've touched on it a lot before, but I think main thing that I'm seeing from a lot of our clients is easy integration with multiple applications to get that cost savings and the efficiencies. So there are not multiple GRC tools in play or blind spots. So I think cross application is a really big one, and making sure that, you know, out of the box, that it's easy for all of these companies to feel comfortable that they're able to connect to this SaaS product, right? I think the other thing is, again, just making sure that there's efficiencies for companies to leverage tools that they may already have in place that they don't necessarily want to replace, to complement those tools. So for example, I see a lot of clients that use ServiceNow as a ticketing tool, for example, and they want to, as part of just maybe in the past they've had that ticketing tool and it manually gets routed to somebody who approves it and then takes it, and, you know, then gets that access updated in the system. You know, integrations between types of ticketing tools or Jira or all of those different tools to make it seamless behind the scenes, just to remove manual intervention wherever possible. Kind of like the use case Ian was describing, where not needing the reliance on all of those extra manual steps that maybe the company is accustomed in paying for. So I think cross application is the big one, and seamless integration with existing tools.
What about you, Navinda?
What I'll add to that is, I think cross application is really quite a big one. And the other one is, Steph mentioned about tools like ServiceNow, which are for ticketing, but we see a large number of clients also using tools like SailPoint, which are, you know, your identity management solutions, whereby single stop shop for assigning access and removing access. So integrating with those tools, because from an Oracle perspective, specifically, from an ERP perspective, there are certain controls which those IDM solutions can't really look at because they're generic tools, and for example, preventative segregation of duties. So how does a platform that is specialized integrate with those tools becomes quite an important cost. Well, from a customer CapEx perspective, it becomes quite important to consider that how you'll have complementary products like that working well. For example, a product like SafePass and SailPoint, ServiceNow and SafePass and so on and so forth. I think that's an area which we see a lot of dynamic movement in. I mean, the question is quite generic, headed in the future. I can't think of any use cases for artificial intelligence or blockchain, but I'm sure in the years ahead, there'll be some really interesting use cases or really good ideas around using advanced technology. But at the moment, these are the kind of areas, cross-application and integrating with IDM and IAM solutions.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Ian?
I mean, I think, integration, as a theme, definitely. When we talk about GRC, it's a very broad generic term. I mean, SafePass, SafePass GRC in terms of looking at, specific risk management and controls around, ERP and other solutions themselves. But then there are also the wider GRC systems that look at, sort of broader risk management, internal control, documentation, testing, etc. And I think, one thing for me around integration would be, getting those types of systems, talking together, so that so that you can kind of pull all of your different control risk management activities together. I think looking at auditor capabilities, making sure the systems are user friendly from an audit perspective and can help facilitate internal, external auditors getting information that they need out of it. I think that's important and a big thing, and a potential cost saver. And it's a changing world. I mean, what is important? What is important today from a controls and risk management perspective? That is going to change over time. And a platform, platforms that are flexible, scalable, with the most minimal time and effort, obviously. I think those are going to be the solutions that do well in the future, and also ones that have a great end user experience as well. Recognizing that a lot of people that use these tools will be knowledgeable in their areas. Maybe they're finance professionals, shared service professionals, process owners. They'll be knowledgeable in their area, not necessarily knowledgeable around maybe from a more technical perspective in the ERP. And I think the more that vendors can make their solutions accessible, readable, understandable for kind of educated end users, I think that will be a defining point in terms of the solutions that are successful in the market going forward.
Yeah. Anybody have anything to add there? Any final thoughts on the question? No. Okay. I think we've covered that there then. So we do have time for some Q&A. So, okay. So Pradeep asks, what about if we're already live on ERP Cloud? How can a solution like SafePass help us?
Shall I take a shot at that, Emma?
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so we're implementing SafePass at about 4 clients now who have already implemented ERP Cloud. And in terms of how it can help, so the use case that most gets presented and is really a great starting point is segregation of duties, because it's a complex area. If you've already got Oracle Cloud, you've got this new system with new concepts, privileges and duty roles and job roles and data access sets and we've got, I mean, the SafePass tool, Enterprise Access Monitor is really quite good at making it really easy for extracting information out of Oracle Cloud and then analyzing it from an SOD perspective and presenting outcomes. So from a detective segregation duties perspective, if you've already gone live with Oracle Cloud, that's the tool I would highly recommend. And we can do a demo and show you how that might work. The other product that, or the other area that I could recommend looking at is the access certification. So periodic access reviews of privileged access. So if you've defined out of your 200 roles, 50 are considered privileged or security wise more important, and enterprise access certification tool can actually help you with automating the full survey process and certification. Then we also have Fusion specific, Oracle Fusion specific functionality there with looking at business units, etc. And it's quite a flexible tool. So I guess, Emma, those are the two areas that I'd consider. There's also, of course, the user provisioning aspect. So you can have preventative SOD from a user provisioning perspective. We've got a tool that can look at that, and also one which monitors configuration changes. But generally, the use cases tend to begin with segregation of duties, and then go on to recertification, user provisioning, and then the more complex configuration change tracking aspects.
Okay, let's take another question here. Maybe this question's for you, Ian. So Misha asks, how difficult was it to have effective segregation of duties controls without GRC tools? Sorry.
I mean, it's possible. You can build specific control objectives around key segregation of duties risks. But the monitoring, how you control and how you monitor those segregation of duty controls, becomes quite difficult. It becomes quite manual, and and also it's often becomes detective rather than preventative. So you are looking at correcting problems after the fact, and therefore when you do identify an issue, you are then also going back and trying to work out what, if anything, actually went wrong during the period that your segregation of duties was ineffective. So in answer to the question, like everything, you can always come up with some way of not necessarily managing it, but at least mitigating the control risk. But I think you'll find that it will be more time consuming, more onerous in terms of the manual activity that's required to do it, and ultimately less effective in not having a level of automated tool that can help you address those SOD control objectives.
Yeah, and I think I've seen working for a service provider like Deloitte. We do have a number of clients that will pay Deloitte or other companies that have developed internal proprietary tools to do periodic SOD scans for them, and then provide them with results from that. And then they'll take those results, and like Ian said, if there have been some conflicts identified, then there's have to go back and do an analysis to say, during the time this person had this SOD conflict, did they actually act on it? Did they use the access that they've had? So there are a number of organizations that actually are outsourcing that to companies that have the ability to do those SOD runs for them, and that's a recurring cost for them, and not just a financial cost. Then they still have to have maybe their DBAs get those extracts and send it to the company, and then the look back analysis and all of that. So I mean, it is quite cumbersome, and sometimes we'll see if companies don't want to implement it at the time of go live, from that perspective, that they'll want us to develop a matrix for them to say, hey, these two responsibilities are not compatible with one another, but that still leaves you a blind spot on, what if one of those responsibilities changes, and then it introduces a risk there. And so there's so many use cases we've seen where more recently a company, like Ian was talking about, was part of the company was going to be going public at the end of the year, and they had hundreds of known SOD conflicts. They weren't necessarily, they weren't SOX compliant. They didn't need to be based on their business. So those conflicts were just kind of sitting there as known conflicts. And then they had a really short window where they wanted to identify the high conflicts, get those remediated, also implement a GRC tool to help them track at the time of go live. And so all of that got really condensed into a few month window, versus if they would have had the visibility from earlier on, it's likely that hundreds of conflicts wouldn't have been introduced into the environment. So there are a lot of companies that have gotten into a situation where it feels almost unmanageable, and it's getting pushed on the back burner until there's some hard requirement, and then there's a rush to try to fix it.
Okay, let's take another question here. Navinda, this one's probably for you. How long does it take to implement SafePass?
So, well, I guess it does depend on the client environment, but I can give a generic idea. If you're implementing the segregation duties tool, let's say for an Oracle Release 12 environment or an Oracle Fusion environment, a couple of examples we implemented at an Oracle Fusion customer in 6 to 8 weeks, and that included requirements, design, and implementation end to end. So it doesn't really take, it doesn't have to take very long. It's not like an ERP program. You're only looking at a certain aspect in great detail. You're working with your key control leads, key finance and procurement leads, and if client resources are available and decisions can be made quickly, it can really be very quick. The other tools as well, they shouldn't. I mean, I think most of them should take between 6 to 12 weeks. But there are certain cases where the requirements are quite complex, and of course that can take longer. So it does depend, but it's nothing like implementing an ERP system or any complex system, and the costs aren't anywhere comparable either. So really, in terms of the previous question that Ian and Steph answered, I mean, it does help quite a lot in terms of providing visibility to auditors once implemented, and they're not really that difficult.
Okay, time for just one more, I think. Okay, so Cecile asks, how does SafePass differ from tools such as Archer that's been around for a long time?
Should I take that as well?
Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, a tool like Archer, Archer and other tools like that are excellent tools for managing a SOX program. So, and I think Ian, you at Milcom used a tool which was similar, where you kind of have all of your hundreds of controls for the SOX program by country, by division, documented in a GRC system, and then you track based on who's responsible for what control, evidencing, etc. So it's very much a risk management solution. Archer is very much a risk management solution, which provides visibility to management around how many controls have been evidenced and how the auditors seeing, etc. But while a tool like SafePass is very specialized, specifically around ERP controls, specifically around IT general controls. So this is like, focusing on a very painful area in great detail and providing evidence for auditors to really tick the box and say everything's okay, while the other tools like Archer are high, very high level across the organization and more around, managing controls and risks. So there's quite a significant difference there.
I would think of it as if you were a specific control owner responsible for monitoring of segregation of duties for certain modules within a certain application, you could really use the SafePass application to help you monitor that and evidence that. And then maybe that evidence is then provided to Archer, which is tracking at a higher level the results of some of the testing of those controls. So it's not like one would replace another; they would be complementary.
No, they both have a role.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for today. So, we are here to help you on your risk journey. So whether you're using EBS and you plan to stay on EBS, we can certainly help you there. If you're considering a move to a cloud, obviously, we have lots of case studies that we can share with you to tell you how we've been helping those customers. If you are live on cloud, we can help you keep the project on track. So, if you've joined today as a potential partner, even we do have a series of, we have a huge partner ecosystem and many programs that we can, discuss with you. So, if you would like to get in touch for a further conversation, discuss a free trial, even a free access controls migration, a POC, use cases for a demo, we are here to help. So please reach out to either Navinda, Stephanie, or myself, and we'll be, glad to help you on your journey. So a huge thank you to our speakers today. So Ian, Stephanie, Navinda, a big thank you to you all for joining today and sharing your experiences and your knowledge with the attendees today. Any final thoughts from the panelists today?
Well, thanks, Emma. I would just say feel free to reach out if you have questions about. Some clients have reached out with very specific use cases that they have for a specific pain point, where we've been able to work with Navinda and team and the product development team to demo for them, whether that's something that's capable that we've done before, etc. So I think that's been really helpful for a lot of clients who are trying to evaluate what GRC tools fit their needs best. So feel free to reach out to Nav and I, and we're happy to help coordinate that.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. So a big thank you to our panelists and a big thank you to all our attendees today. And hopefully we'll see you again next month. So have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Bye.